but it wasn't. Now, I wrote about that. I did describe in my book. In fact, I had a chapter on the housing bubble. In fact, I initially was going to write a whole book on the housing bubble, but I didn't think it would be interesting enough to do a whole book just on that one topic. So I put it as a chapter, and so I wrote about the housing bubble and why we had one, how government policy was inflating it, and what was going to happen to the economy when it burst. What was going to happen to the financial sector, to the banks, what would happen to Fannie and Freddie, and how bad the recession was going to be when the housing bubble burst. But that was not the crash that I was writing about. That was part of the process, but it wasn't the end of it. It was kind of in the middle. And what I wrote in the book was that I believed that maybe the bursting of this housing bubble would ultimately be the catalyst for the real crash. Because what I wrote at that time, what I've been talking about, was that once the housing bubble burst, and we had all the bank failures, and Fannie and Freddie went bankrupt, and we had the worst recession since the Great Depression, double-digit unemployment, $1 trillion deficits. I did forecast all that. That was not the crash that I was worried about. What I was worried about was that the government would respond to this crisis the way it always does, by blaming it on capitalism and by calling for more government solutions in the form of money printing, stimulus. Now, I didn't call it quantitative easing because they hadn't coined that term yet. But I was predicting it before it happened. I just said they would print money, they would lower interest rates and try to reflate the bubble, try to get asset prices to go back up so that Americans can spend money they didn't have, and you can try to repeat all the mistakes that led to the crisis. Well, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, I forget the exact date, we finally got that from the Fed. The Fed finally announced that it was going to go all in on quantitative easing with QE3, to infinity, right? Of course, Paul Krugman said it wasn't big enough. Because I guess they should have announced QE to eternity. Because maybe from even after Ben Bernanke died, you'd have to promise more QE from the grave. But of course, Paul Krugman always says that the Keynesian stimulus isn't big enough, so he can always be right when it doesn't work. Because he says, well, it just needs to be bigger. But I've known that this day was inevitable all along. Right? I knew that this is where we were headed. And the crash that I was forecasting when I wrote Crash Proof was a crash of the dollar. See, that hadn't happened yet. And why do I believe the dollar would collapse? Because I believe the Fed would kill it by printing too many. That it would ultimately try to revive the economy, and the end result would be that it would kill the dollar. That we would get an overdose of stimulus. I knew that stimulus was the problem. It was government stimulus that created the national bubble, and when it burst, they used the same stimulus to create the housing bubble. And when it burst, they created what I described in my latest book as a government bubble. You can see that bubble in the bond market, but in the size of the government and the deficits that were spending. But I think that ultimately they would continue to administer this monetary heroin until we died of overdose, and it would be seen in the dollar. And collapse of the dollar, and ultimately the bursting of the bond market bubble, sending interest rates skyrocketing, the dollar plunging, and then we would have a real crash. Now, we haven't had that yet. In fact, a lot of people try to make fun of me when we had the bursting of the stock of the real estate bubble, And I had written this book, Crash Proof, and I outlined the investment strategy for Crash Proof, which was buying gold, buying silver, buying foreign currency, buying foreign stocks. And in 2008, the second half of 2008, all the things that I recommended went down. And so people said, you see, leadership was wrong. See, he said to buy gold and buy foreign stocks, and they went down. Yeah, they did go down. Because the crash that I was preparing for hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. I'm convinced it's going to happen. So far, all of the things that I said would happen before the crash have happened. Now, I guess if I was a complete genius, what I could have recommended in my book was sit in cash and then wait for the housing bubble to burst and wait for the rally of the dollar and then sell all your dollars and buy your gold and buy your foreign stocks. So I guess I could have been perfect had I basically said do that. But you never know. I don't know exactly all the nuances. No one can be that smart to know exactly how we're going to get from here to there. I just know that where we're going to end up. And so when I see these things, I'm seeing through to the end of the game. I don't know every single curve in the path that we're going And it's hard to gamble. I mean, basically, knowing the things that I knew back in '04 and '05, it would have been almost crazy to actually forecast that huge dollar range. I mean, imagine, here I am, trying to, seeing this huge bubble, seeing that this housing market's going to implode, all these big banks are going to fail. I mean, fail, big banks, like, I think we're going to fail. That Fannie and Freddie, these huge companies, would go to zero, they go bankrupt. That we were going to have $1 billion deficits. That this whole phony economy was going to implode. And then knowing all that, I was going to have to say, let's buy the dollar. This is going to be great for the dollar. So, it's hard to know that that's how people would react, because people are so brainwashed into thinking that the dollar is a safe haven, that even when the problem was in America, the safe haven was the dollar. In fact, probably the epitome of this irrationality happened when S&P downgraded U.S. Treasuries. Now, of course, the fact that S&P downgrading is meaningless because, these are the guys that had AAA ratings on the subprime paper, even when it went to zero. Now, I knew that the paper was worthless, even though I didn't have any analysts studying it. Who knows how much money S&P and Moody's spent studying all this paper, and they came away with AAA. Right? I mean, I didn't do any of that. I could just see as an observer, let's see, there are guaranteed mortgages on real estate prices that have doubled, where people put down very little collateral. Yeah, that's not going to work out. I mean, I knew that they have their total collateral in Fannie and Freddie, they had 3 or 4% collateral, assets behind the mortgage. So even a small default, and that was all it took. So I didn't need to waste any money to know that all this mortgage-backed paper was going to go to zero. But these guys, all their money and all their high fancy degrees, they analyzed it. They said, it's AAA. So the state organization downgrades U.S. Treasuries, and they say, okay, it's not AAA anymore, it's AA plus, one notch down. Which of course I think is junk. And by the time S&P says it's junk, it'll be worthless if you own it. They're not going to downgrade it in advance. But on the day that S&P downgraded U.S. Treasuries, right, on that day, people were so scared. The stock market got killed that day. And people were so scared of the implications of the downgraded U.S. Treasuries that they bought U.S. Treasuries as a safe haven from Treasuries. Right? And now everybody's convinced it doesn't even matter what our credit rating is. And people actually think if we get downgraded again, there'll be another rally. Right? The lower our credit quality is, the more people go and buy the stuff that's been downgraded because they're worried about the downgrade. So that's what happened. And now, another thing happened that I didn't necessarily forecast. Although I talked about it, but I didn't necessarily try to put a date on it. But that is the crisis that had been playing out in Europe, and it's still playing out there. And a lot of U.S. politicians have blamed our sluggish recovery on Europe, and that's a big excuse that Obama can come up with, a long line of excuses. But one of them is, Europe, right? It's not my fault. I mean, look at all the problems in Europe, and so that's why the recovery isn't going any stronger. Well, I think it's actually the opposite. I think the problems in Europe are actually propping us up. I think because people think it's worse in Europe, that we're actually got a little bit of a reprieve. Unfortunately, we're not using it beneficially. We're not using it to fix our problems. We're just taking the extra rope and fastening it into the noose. But because people are so worried about Europe, people are buying the dollar as a safe haven from the euro. They're buying the U.S. Treasury market as a safe haven from Spanish debt, or Italian debt, or Greek debt. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't make any sense. If you are a creditor of Spain, and you're deciding that you're going to sell your bond because you're worried about Spain, the last thing you should do is buy dollars, because we're even in worse shape than they are. We have more debt as a percentage of GDP, and we're less able to pay it. The only thing we can do is print. And right now, the world is not focusing on the risk associated with printing. They're just worried about default. And they look at America and they say, well, America doesn't have to default, because they can print. Well, that's a big difference there. Just because we can print money doesn't mean it's going to have any value when you get it. You hear all the arguments about how, we have a printing press. That's the problem that we have a printing press. creditors are going to stop focusing on whether or not they get their money back, and they're going to focus on what the money is going to be worth when they get it back. Because it is impossible for America to pay back its debts. It's not even within the realm of possibility. We have a national debt. Apparently, Barack Obama doesn't even know what it is. He was on the Leno show, I think, was it Leno or Jay Leno? What was it? Huh? Leonard, yeah. And Leonard said, what is the national debt? About 10 trillion? There's ass on it. I mean, he wasn't close. But anyway, so it's 16 trillion to count. It actually went over 16 trillion during his convention. Do you think he wouldn't have noticed that? But anyway, so, and of course, that $16 trillion debt, that doesn't even tell the whole story. That's the tip of a huge iceberg. Because it doesn't count the unfunded liabilities. It doesn't count the off-budget items. You've got Social Security, Medicare, you've got all kinds of trust funds. And even look at student loans, right? We're in a university. There's $1 trillion, more than $1 trillion of student loans. You know, a lot of students who are taking out their loans are spending 5-6 years majoring in sociology. You think they're good for that money? You think they're actually paying that money back for those degrees? No, they're just going to move back in with their parents, and they're not going to have a job to pay off those loans. So what percentage of those student loans are going to end up being on the taxpayer? I say most of them, right? But none of that is counted as part of our debt, even though we as the U.S. government is standing behind every one of those student loans. All these deadbeats graduated with worthless degrees with a $50,000 to $100,000 debt. The U.S. Treasury owes that, right? And in fact, there is a policy right now of forgiving the debt. I mean, that's part of the Obama is moving in the direction of basically bailouts for college students. You know, forgive the debt. Well, they don't forgive it; they just stick the taxpayer with the bill. So there's more money that the government has obligated everybody in this room to pay. But if we just look at the 16 trillion, that one piece, say how can we even pay that? Can we pay back $16 trillion? The government collects about $2.5 trillion a year in taxes. So the national debt is what, 7 or 8 times what the government collects in a year. I mean, that's like an individual. I mean, owing, if you make $50,000 a year and you have, debt that's seriously owe $400,000, what do you pay back? No, because it gets bigger every year. We add another trillion. This year the deficit is $1.3 trillion. It's a number that keeps growing. It's not like it's a home mortgage where you advertise it, it's going down. It gets bigger every single year. But it's 16 trillion right now. What if we have to pay it back? In fact, if you look at the maturities of the debt, it's not like it is a 30-year mortgage. About a third of the debt comes due in a year. So we have the $16 trillion debt, but we borrowed the money with treasury bills. And so in the next year or so, let's say $5 trillion of it matures. Well, imagine what would you do if you were, if you were a homeowner and your mortgage matured next year? Right? I mean, that's what we got. We got $5 trillion. The government collects $2.5 trillion in taxes. How's it going to pay off $5 trillion next year when it only collects half that amount? Well, the idea is we're not going to have to. Well, we're not going to have to. We'll just borrow the money. That's the plan. Right? The plan is when those bonds mature, we're just going to sell them to somebody else. In fact, the plan is to sell them to the same people who own the maturing bonds. Right? So this is the plan. So we owe all this money. The plan is, don't worry, we don't have to pay it back because we'll borrow it from people who own it. And where do we get the interest to pay the money, to pay the interest on the money that we borrow? Well, we borrow that from the same people. So we say, loan me some money. And by the way, can you loan me a little more money so I can pay the interest? And then when the bond matures, well, can you loan me that money too so I can pay it back? That's our plan. Right? That's how the whole thing works. Well, who had that plan? Right? There's another guy who was in 150-year jail sentence. His plan is exactly the same. Bernie Madoff. In fact, Bernie Madoff, he actually came out in an interview, right? And he actually said that he was like a piper compared to the U.S. government. The U.S. government was running the biggest Ponzi scheme ever, right? Bernie Madoff. And everybody dismissed him. All the reporters said, oh, well, Bernie Madoff doesn't have any credibility. Who's going to listen to him? Well, you know what? Bernie Madoff has credibility on one thing, and that's Ponzi scheme. So if he says that the U.S. government runs the biggest Ponzi scheme, You got to pay attention to it because there's no new Ponzi scheme when he sees it. And in fact, when you ask Bernie Madoff, because he in his interview said, why did you keep doing this? Didn't you know? And he said, yeah, I was hoping for a miracle. I just kept doing it, hoping for. That's what the government's doing. They're hoping for a miracle. They're hoping that there's some way out of it. But the reality is, when our creditors want their money back, if they don't want to keep lending us money, then the party's over. You see, Bernie Madoff's plan worked as long as nobody wanted their money back. As long as he could find a sucker who didn't know it was a Ponzi scheme, he can keep it going. But when our creditors don't want to play this game anymore, and in fact, it was one part of the problem. Remember we had the argument over raising the debt ceiling. And there was an attempt in Congress, so it was kind of early half-assed, but to try to prevent them from raising the debt ceiling. And everybody was like, oh, this is going to be terrible, this is going to be a disaster, we have to raise the debt ceiling because we need to show people that we're committed to paying our bills. Right? That was what they said. We have to raise the debt ceiling so we show people that we're going to pay our bills. See, that was showing people that we're not going to pay our bills. See, paying your bills would not going deeper into debt, actually paying the bill. Right? Borrowing more money so you don't have to pay your bills is not how you show the world that you're credible. But that was the whole argument that we need to go into debt. And here's what they said. We said if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to default. That's what they said. That's what the Secretary of the Treasury said. That's what Ben Bernanke said. You remember, they said you can't do this because if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to have to default on our debts. So that's basically an official admission that is a Ponzi scheme. Which normally when you're running a Ponzi scheme, you want to keep it quiet. You don't want to come out and say it. But that's what the U.S. government did. The U.S. government told all of our creditors exactly where they stand on the totem pole. Right? It wasn't Ben Bernanke, President Obama didn't say, listen, Americans, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to have an across-the-board tax hike so we can pay the Japanese and the Chinese the interest on their bonds. He didn't say we're going to have an across-the-board cut in government payrolls, salaries, pensions, Social Security, Medicare. No. The first thing he said is we can't borrow more money, we're just going to default on the money we've already borrowed. That was it. Game over. They made it a Ponzi scheme. Well, of course, they ended up raising the debt ceiling, and now they're probably going to raise it, forever. A lot of don't even realize where we got the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling was actually introduced when the Federal Reserve was introduced in 1913, and a couple of years later we got into the First World War. And at the time, the Federal Reserve was not allowed to own any U.S. government bonds. It was prohibited from doing so in its initial charter. And they wanted to make it easier for Congress to finance World War I. And so they changed the Federal Reserve Act to allow the Federal Reserve to hold treasuries as collateral. And some of the congressmen were worried about that incestuous relationship. And they said, wait a minute, we might have opened up Pandora's box here. We don't want to let the government sell bonds to the Federal Reserve because it could get out of hand. We better put a limit on that. So they put a debt limit on it. I don't remember what it was, like 10 billion or some tiny little number. But the problem is, they didn't really think it through because Congress raised the ceiling every time it got near. So it was like an ever-escalating ceiling, which means that there's no ceiling. It's all just a game that they put on. But now they're not even, nobody even wants to challenge it. In fact, people are saying that they should repeal the debt ceiling to show that we're serious about paying our bills. It's like, you don't pay your MasterCard with your Visa, right? That's what they're trying to do with the debt ceiling. But anyway, the point that I try to make is we can't possibly pay. All we can do is hope that nobody notices, right? And that's exactly what was happening in Europe. Why do we have this crisis in Europe? What happened in Greece? Why did Greece implode? And why did it happen now? Why didn't it happen 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Well, what happened was interest rates in Greece a few years ago were very, very low, just like they are here. And people were dumb enough to loan the Greek government a bunch of money at a low rate of interest, even though it was obvious to anybody that they couldn't pay back, but nobody cared. And so the Greek government took advantage of that cheap money, and they used it to buy votes and give all the voters in Greece big government perks. And then all of a sudden, at some point in time,
maybe two people were talking, about Greek debt, maybe they own the bonds, or maybe somebody looked and said, hey, you think the Greeks can pay back this money? And maybe someone bought from it and says, they can't, no way, they can't pay back. And that was the end of it. Now all of a sudden, when the bonds matured, the creditors wanted their money back. They didn't want to play the game anymore. They didn't want to roll it over. And then interest rates spiked. And then that was the end of it. Same thing is going to happen to us. How is it that we can pretend that we can pay a $16 trillion debt? Well, we can service it. You know how much interest we're paying on our national debt right now? It's something like $350 billion a year. That's a big number, but it's tiny compared to $16 trillion. Why is it so tiny? Well, because the Federal Reserve's got interest rates at zero. In fact, I believe one of the main reasons the Fed has interest rates at zero is because it knows if it lets interest rates go up, the government's going to have to default on its debts. It doesn't want that to happen. So it keeps interest rates at zero so the government can keep borrowing. Because if it wasn't at zero, they couldn't do it anymore. You see, the biggest problem, and I know why, when they announced QE1, I knew that we would have QE2. In fact, I was forecasting it, and the minute they announced QE2, I said we're going to have QE3. In fact, for a while, I was saying we're going to have more QEs than Rocky movies. And the reason I said that is because I knew they wouldn't work. I knew that quantitative easing was the economic equivalent to throwing gasoline on a fire. And I know that if you're going to throw gasoline on the fire, it's not going to go out. And if the only thing you know is to put more gasoline on it, well, then I know you're going to do it forever until you burn yourself and you can't do it anymore. Right? And so I knew all these QEs were coming. But the main reason that the Fed is doing it is to keep the government propped up, to enable the government to run enormous deficits that, absent that cheap money, it couldn't run. If interest rates were allowed to rise, which we need to do, and that's another part of the problem, I know from an economic perspective, the biggest problem for the U.S. economy is that interest rates are too low. That is the single biggest problem. All the other problems flow from that. All the malinvestments, all the misallocation of resources, all start with interest rates being too low. Why are they too low? It's not the free market that's keeping them low. It's the government, it's central planners that have pushed down the interest rate to a level well below where the market would want it. And whenever you have price fixing, you have distortions, you have problems. No matter what it is. If the government decides to fix the price of bread or the price of gasoline, you're going to have shortages, you're going to have long lines. It's not going to work. You need the market to set the price so it's efficient and you have a clearing price and you have a good balance between savers and borrowers. But we don't have that in America. Because interest rates are so low, nobody saves. I mean, you'd be an idiot to save. I mean, the interest rate is zero. I mean, after inflation, it's negative. Even if you believe the government's, inflation numbers, it still wipes out your yield. And you got to pay income taxes on the nominal. So you're losing money. So nobody is saving. Everybody wants to borrow. Wall Street borrows to gamble. Americans borrow. So everybody's borrowing money. Nobody is saving. So the free market wouldn't have that. In the free market, interest rates would have to rise to encourage savings and to discourage borrowing. So we can have more savings, so we can have more capital investment, so we can produce more, so we can grow the economy, have productive jobs, and all that. Everything flows from savings. But we're not getting any of that because the government, the Federal Reserve, won't allow it. Because the problem is the economy is so screwed up from years and years of these malinvestments that in order for the economy to restructure itself, which it would do if the Fed got out of the way, there would be a lot of short-term pain. And of course, the longer the Fed delays it, the more painful it is because there's more mistakes that have been made. We exacerbate the underlying problems that the market wants to correct. So more of our resources go towards consumption and housing and government and finance and education and healthcare. Resources go where the government wants them. But they're pulled away from where the market wants them to be. They're not in real productive areas, and so the economy gets worse and worse, and you need more and more stimulus to keep it from imploding. Just like any other drug, it's like you build up a tolerance. And the other reason that the Fed wants to keep the QE flowing, it's not just the government that needs it, it's the whole financial sector. It's all these big banks. They need cheap money. Because the whole model right now, the banks borrow money from the Fed, and then they turn around and they loan it to the U.S. Treasury. I mean, the biggest buyers of Treasury, other than the Federal Reserve and foreign central banks, are our banks. And where are they getting the money to buy? They're not getting it from their depositors, they're getting it from the Fed. So they borrow from the Fed and then they lend to the Treasury. See, people say the banks aren't lending any money. Sure they are, they're lending it all to the government. Where do you think the government is getting all this money? It's borrowing $1.3 trillion a year. Somebody's lending that money. So a lot of it comes from the banks. Of course, they get the money from the Fed. So the Fed buys bonds directly and they buy it indirectly. But it's not just treasuries, it's mortgages, which are all guaranteed by the government now. And so that's just like treasuries. So all this money. But what would happen if the Federal Reserve allowed interest rates to go up? What would happen to those banks? Well, a lot of those banks would fail. Because all of a sudden it would cost 5 or 6 or 7% to get money from the Fed. But now they're stuck earning 2 or 3% on their treasuries, or 4% on their mortgages. Well, now they don't have positive cash flow, they have negative cash flow. But what happens to their assets? Their assets implode. Because if you've got a bond, if you've got a 30 to 10-year treasury that's earning 2%, and now the market rate is 7%, what's your treasury worth? It's not worth 100 cents on the dollar anymore. Maybe it's worth 65 cents. And when you're levered up 40 times, whatever these banks are, and you take this big haircut on your assets, these things are going to implode. What's going to happen to the real estate market when mortgage rates go up? And what happens to the banks? So the whole banking sector will implode again, worse than 2008. So the Fed knows that it has to keep maintaining this. And in fact, when people go back and credit the Federal Reserve, they say the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke was their hero. He saved the economy from a fate worse than the Great Depression. No, he didn't save the economy. He sealed the economy's fate. He guaranteed that it would be worse than the Great Depression. All he did is postpone the thing. He didn't, he didn't eliminate it. He just pushed it into the future. But in pushing it into the future, he made it worse. Instead of addressing the imbalances, we exacerbated it. Now they're bigger. And it doesn't mean we can escape them forever. Because this is the point that we're headed to. And the whole point behind the real crash is at some point, the Fed is going to lose control of its ability to keep interest rates down. At some point, people won't be as worried about Europe. And I still think, and I've talked about this from the inception, that the European model is flawed. That there are serious moral hazards around the euro and the countries that share that common currency. And so, long term, I don't think that the euro is going to survive, at least not the way it is now. But I think if you compare the euro to the dollar, I think the dollar is sicker. We both might be terminal, but we got less time. And so I think that Europe is in a position where they can at least put a band-aid on the crisis and convince people that it's going to work. Maybe even though it's not going to. But we know that these things can go on for a long time. And there's a lot of wealth in Europe. There are a lot of wealthy northern economies that can subsidize these other economies for a while. Right? That doesn't exist here. We're broke, right? And so when the pressure is off and the euro is rising, and the euro has been rising, and a lot of people were predicting a euro collapse, the euro would go to parity with the dollar, the euro would go down. It didn't happen. That shows you how weak the dollar is, that the euro couldn't even sell off against the dollar, even when it was in the center of the crisis. At some point, the dollar is going to be going down. I think if you look at a chart right now, look at the dollar against a lot of currencies, and of course, if you look against the Aussie dollar, some other currencies, you can really see how weak the dollar is. But it looks to me like it's in the process of rolling over and falling, and the dollar index is just below the 80 level, which has always been like a long-term kind of a low support level. Gold is breaking out. I'm looking at gold is $1,750, almost $1,800 an ounce. Oil prices would have been above 100, I think, right now, if Saudi Arabia didn't come out and talk it down to help Obama. And Obama, of course, threatened to unleash a lot of oil from the strategic reserve. So they're temporarily manipulating the price of oil. They're trying to get it down for the election. But the overwhelming trend is up because of the inflation. But what's going to happen is the world is going to refocus its attention on our imbalances. They're not going to be as worried about Europe, and they're going to look at our current account deficit, our trade deficit, our lack of domestic savings, the promise from the Fed to have QE to infinity. In fact, look at the economic data we just got this week. GDP second quarter just revised down to 1.3%. 1.3% growth. And that's based on an inflation rate of 1.6%. Now, who believes that inflation is 1.6% a year right now? But that's how low the government had to assume it was to get GDP growth of 1.3. Now, what if inflation is 3% and not 1.6%? And I think it's far more likely that it's 3. In fact, it's probably higher than 3. Well, if inflation is higher than 3, that means we're already in a recession. Because that means GDP would have contracted in the second quarter if inflation was 3%. And to me, anecdotally, that's more believable. I mean, if you look at the labor force participation rate, it's the lowest it's been since the Second World War, if you look at adult men. And because before the 1970s, most adult women didn't work. I mean, their husbands could afford to support them. They didn't have to work. Now they're working. But even if you look at women, if you include women, it's the lowest labor force participation rate since like 1971. Now, we have millions and millions of people who used to be in the labor force aren't working anymore. A lot of them are on disability. How can the economy be growing when all these people are leaving the labor force and are no longer participating in growing the economy? I mean, is everybody else so much more productive that the economy is growing despite the fact that millions of people are leaving the workforce? How can that be? You know, the unemployment rate, which the government admits to at 8%, is actually better than 15%, right? If you count the people that are working part-time and are still looking for work, or discouraged workers. So, does it make sense that there's so many people unemployed, yet the economy is still growing? That doesn't. I think it makes more sense that the economy is shrinking. It's not growing. That's why there aren't jobs, or if people are losing jobs, so naturally the economy is getting smaller because fewer people are participating in that economy. And that makes more sense to me, that the government is just not being honest. Not that they're, getting inflation numbers and then say, oh, we can't report that, that's too high. Go back to the drawing board and do it again. I don't think they're doing that. It's not. But what I do think is that the methodology for measuring inflation is flawed from its inception. I think it's been designed to get a number that's low. In fact, they admitted that when they did the original Boston Commission. The government said that the inflation calculations, the methodology for producing the CPI, was overstating inflation. And they said, we're going to fix it. And they did. That was understating inflation. But that's what the government wanted. And look at the numbers that came out this morning. Consumer income up 0.1%, but prices were up 0.4 for the month. Well, gee, well, that means consumer income actually fell. Spending was up 0.5, but most of it, 80% of that increase in spending, was because things cost more. So it wasn't that people bought more stuff, they just bought the same stuff, they just paid more for it. And where did they get the money? Well, the savings rate went down to 3.7%. It's dropping like a rock again. And what is the Federal Reserve trying to do? The Federal Reserve, we're broke, right? We're broke because we borrow all this money and we spend it. And what is the goal of QE3 then? Right? The goal of QE3 is to get Americans to spend money. And in fact, think about it. Listen to this, right? Because this is what the Fed came up with. The Fed's brilliant plan to revive the economy. This is it in a nutshell. And this is what they were actually saying. This is what they came up with. I don't know who was the first in the Fed to figure it out, but I mean, they obviously thought it was a great idea. They gave it and here's their idea. They're going to bring interest rates down. They're going to keep interest rates at 0 for a few more years. And they're going to buy $40 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities with money they create out of thin air, in addition to the treasury they're buying. And they're going to buy up all these bonds, so that Americans can take that cheap money and buy houses. And their idea is this, that if more Americans take cheap money and buy houses, that housing prices will go up. And if housing prices go up, more people want to buy houses because they think they can get rich. And as more people buy houses, the prices go up, and we all feel richer because of the wealth effect. We'll go out and borrow more money against our homes, and we'll spend it. And then when we do that, we'll grow the economy because we'll be spending more money, and then people will want to buy houses, and then more people want to build houses, and we can create this great economy based on housing wealth turned into consumption. That's their plan. I mean, that's what they did. That's what they just did. That's exactly how we got into this mess. And can you imagine that's the only thing they got? How do we revive the economy? Let's create a housing bubble. We just
Now the good news is it's not going to work. But the crazy thing is that they're even going to try. This is what they're trying to do, but it's actually like an admission that they caused the last bubble. The goal of this policy, which is exactly the policy they had before, is to try to create another one. But that's all they got. In fact, Ben Bernanke admitted this in his testimony or his Q&A. He said, look, we only have one tool. So even if it doesn't work, they're going to use that tool. Right? They're just going to say, well, we're not getting any help from Congress, so this is what we're going to do. So they're doing this QE now to try to get people who are already broke to spend more money. Well, it's not going to work, right? We're too strung out on QE. And so where we're going, and what I meant to talk about is, so the world's not, the creditors are not going to be worried about Europe. They're not going to believe the inflation numbers. At some point, all this money printed, it's not going to reflate the housing market. There is no way they're going to do that. There are too many holes in that bubble. We don't have that mentality anymore in the housing market. In fact, I just had my house appraised because I'm doing a refi now, and I'm down to 4% for my mortgage. And you can get lower, this is a jumbo, so it's hard to get much lower. But maybe, I don't know, someone else is telling me now that maybe 3, 7, 8. But I just had my house appraised, and when they appraise your house, they give you a market, based on comps, and then they try to do a replacement cost to, actually build a house. And the value of my house in the market is about 20% less than it would cost to build it, even if I got my land for nothing. So, how are you going to reflate a housing bubble in that environment when even if you build a house, it's worth less than the cost of constructing it? There's a 2-year supply of houses. And when I got my appraisal, the appraiser noted that in my town, the supply of houses is 2 years' worth on the market. 2 years. You're not going to get a housing bubble with all this inventory and with all the foreclosures that have been backed up. I mean, one of the reasons that prices aren't even lower is because it takes 2 or 3 years to kick somebody out of the house. In fact, I read a study that the homeownership rate in America right now, if you count the people who are either in foreclosure or close to it as not being actual homeowners, and of course they're really not homeowners, they're just living there until the bank kicks them out. But if you actually count them, the home ownership rate in America is the lowest it's been in 50 years. 50 years! Which shows you how everything the government does backfires. Right? What was the goal of government housing policy? They wanted to subsidize housing so that home ownership would increase. Instead, they destroyed it to the lowest rate in 50 years because they bankrupted all the people who took that cheap money and overpaid for houses. Right? So they're not going to be able to reflate a housing bubble. We're not going to get all that phony wealth and excess consumption. It's just going to go into higher food prices, higher gasoline prices, and of course, the healthcare costs are rising, education, all the prices are going up. And eventually, the Fed is not going to be able to say with a straight face that there's no inflation. Because that's the only reason that they can keep interest rates at zero, is because they can pretend there's no inflation. Right? But they always have to say, look, don't trust me, if we ever see any inflation, well, we're going to raise interest rates right away. Well, they can't. Because the minute the Fed raises interest rates, well, now the party's over. The minute they raise interest rates, the banks fail. Bank of America, Citibank, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, all these banks fail. That was the government to do. They raise interest rates. Let's say the national debt is at 20 trillion in a couple of years, and now the Fed raises interest rates to 5%. What's 5% of 20 trillion? That's $1 trillion. What if rates have to go to 10%? And that's $2 trillion. That's all the government's tax revenue. I mean, how can that even be? The numbers are so enormous. And people think, well, that's impossible. Rates will never be 10%. Well, they were 20% when Volcker was there. Look, they're 7% now in Spain or Italy. I mean, why can't they be 7%? What would, So the numbers are enormous. Right? So the federal government would have to default, banks would fail. And not only that, remember, if banks are failing and the Fed is tightening, there's no bailout. See, the way the Fed was able to bail everybody out last time is they eased. But if banks are failing while the Fed is tightening, they have to let them fail. And it's not just going to be the next time around, it's not just going to be the shareholders who get wiped out. It's not just going to be bondholders who lose their
depositors will lose money. Because if the bank fails and the Fed is tightening, how is the government going to bail out the banks? See, the FDIC doesn't have any money. So where is Congress going to get the money when it can't borrow any more money? Because remember, the government itself is going to be in need of a bailout, and it's not going to have one. So when interest rates are skyrocketing and the Fed is tightening and won't buy treasuries, then not only does the government have to default on its own obligations, but it has to let banks fail, and it has to let depositors lose their money. So this is the rock and a hard place that the Fed is going to end up in. Either it raises interest rates to maintain its credibility on fighting inflation, or it drags its feet, which I think it's going to do initially. I think the Fed is going to initially tolerate an increase in inflation. And the Fed will initially say, look, it's a good thing because at least it means we avoided deflation. Right? And then it'll say, oh, well, inflation is good for us. And so for a while, but then it's going to get out of hand. And it won't take long either. It's going to be very quick. Now, once you let that inflation genie out of the bottle, it's very hard to contain it. And so it might be the Fed might buy a few months by pretending it's okay with it. But as it gets worse and worse, then there's more pressure on the Fed to do something. If it doesn't do anything, then it loses its credibility. See, right now it still has some. I don't know why. But people still believe that the Fed is willing to raise interest rates to fight inflation when there's no way that they are going to do that voluntarily. Because then it'll be a worse collapse than we would have had we done it earlier. So the Fed is going to just pretend. And eventually, people will realize that they're all bark and there's no bite, and then all of a sudden, there's people want out of the bond market. And then what? People start selling bonds. Quantitative easing, people think that that's good for the bond market. It's only good for the bond market if you're a seller. If you're smart enough to sell your bonds to the Federal Reserve, then it's good because you got out. But if you're buying bonds and holding on to them, remember, where does the Fed get money to buy bonds? It creates out of thin air. So even though in the short run they prop up the market by buying the bonds, the fact that they have to print the money to do it means the bonds have less value. Because now the money that they're going to pay you with is now less valuable. So printing money to buy bonds is bad for bonds, not good. And when our creditors figured out, and now they realize that Ben Bernanke is going to let the dollar erode, he was lying. He's not going to fight inflation. He's going to tolerate it because he can't fight it without bringing on a financial collapse far worse than 2008 with no ability for the bailout. So he just lets the inflation. And then all of a sudden, so people want to dump dollars, they want to dump treasuries, they want to dump their corporate bonds, they want to dump their munis. Now it's a spot, there's all the pressures coming on. Now the Fed has to print even more money. Because now even more people are trying to get rid of their bonds. No one wants to hold anything. And of course, the more money they print, higher prices go, the worse the inflation gets. If they sit there and do nothing, then it's just a self-perpetuating spiral, which will eventually end in the dollar being worthless. Just pathetic. Now, at some point, I believe the Fed is going to have to do something because you can't make the dollar worthless. You can't go into a Zimbabwe, Weimar Republic style hyperinflation. That is what will happen if we continue to do exactly what we're doing. I think at some point, the Fed will actually realize that it can't do that, and then it's going to have to slam on the brakes. Who knows how much value the dollar might lose between now and then, how much inflation we might have, prices might double, they might triple. But the Fed will ultimately have to do what it's been reluctant to do all these years, which is take the punch bowl away and basically fess up and level with the American public, and then we're going to we have a complete implosion of this phony economy that's been built up. And those are the only choices that we have. Is we have runaway inflation, or we let this whole thing implode and just let the market repair the damage. And the longer we wait, the more damage the market is going to have to repair. The biggest fear that I have, and then I'll open it up and I'll take questions, but the biggest fear that I have is that we don't learn our lesson and that we blame it all on capitalism. And that is what I think Obama is liking to do. I think President Obama is always looking for a failure to confirm his ideas that capitalism doesn't work. And so whenever something happens that goes wrong, he just blames it on capitalism. He's looking for that opportunity. And so another massive collapse will simply solidify his belief that capitalism doesn't work, and that we need to reinvent the United States with a different model. The model that they had in the old Soviet Union, or Cuba, or communist China, only he thinks that it'll work better here because he's smarter and he knows what he's doing. And we just need to have a centrally planned economy. They won't recognize that it's government that did it. I'm hoping that we can figure it out by then, that the destruction and devastation will be so massive, on such an enormous scale, that doing the same thing again, might seem, how can we possibly do it? So I think that we could potentially have an epiphany, a revolution, and realize, wait a minute, we've tried this for so long, let's try something different. Why don't we actually try capitalism? It's working well in China. We gotta give it a shot. It worked really well in America. We became really rich as a capitalist country. We had capitalism in the 19th century. We became extremely wealthy. And so I'm hopeful that we can go on that path, but it's not a sure thing. I mean, great civilizations have destroyed themselves, and we're in the process of doing that if we don't admit this. Maybe I was talking about it on my radio show today, even in the simplest things. The government always interferes in the free market, and they create a problem. And it never occurs to them that they're the source. Right? That the government can come in and bring interest rates down to 0 or 1%, so that people can, and then guarantee mortgages, so that banks would loan money to people who obviously couldn't pay the money back. And then there's a housing bubble that explodes, and they don't even make a connection between subsidized mortgage rates, low interest rates, and the fact that home prices went up. They think they're completely oblivious. It's like that cartoon character, Mr. Magoo, who drives around, and there's all these accidents all around him, and he has no idea that he's causing them. But a perfect example of it, and it shows you even on a tiny, tiny scale. So Michelle Obama has her deal where her cause, and for some reason all the first ladies need to have a cause. I don't know. But anyway, her cause is obesity, childhood obesity. And of course, there are a lot of obese kids in America, probably because their parents were obese. And that's the problem, right? And so she wants to solve it by changing the school lunches. So I was reading a story about New Jersey, these kids in New Jersey, that are going on some kind of strike because they're starving to death, because the lunches are now so small that they don't have a decent meal in school, because they took out the meat, and the bread, and they gave them salad and vegetables, or salad and fruits. And I don't know, a lot of these young 14, 15, 16-year-old boys, they're growing and a salad's just not cutting it for them. And one of the kids said, I finished lunch, and I'm like, what are you going to eat? You're still hungry. And so the government now is figuring that, okay, there's a problem here, so what's the government solution? Now they want to have a government snack program. So that they can have snacks during the day to make up for the fact that they're hungry. How about just letting them eat, and then the other crazy part about it is these smaller meals are actually a lot more expensive. And apparently a lot of it is because they have to buy a lot of stuff that they just throw out because the kids don't even eat it. And that's part of the reason that they're hungry. They don't want this crap. But it wouldn't occur to the government that the reason they're hungry is because they took the meat out of their lunch. And then maybe they should put it back. And then they need another government program to undo the damage of the last one. But even, I guess, suppose in their own methodology, because even though the price of those lunches went up, see, through Udanis, they can claim that it went down. Because they can say, yes, it's more expensive, but it's better. See, it's healthier for you. And so even though you're paying more money for it, we're going to count it as a price cut. Because they can adjust it for quality. So that they never see, even with something as simple as hungry kids in a school cafeteria, they still can't figure it out. They still don't, they never want to admit, and that is the mentality. Right? The government grows the economy. It's not the private sector. It's not the free market. Or even Hillary Clinton gave a speech the other day, and she was talking about how we have to have more taxes on the rich all around the world because they're not doing anything to grow the economy. They're not contributing because they're not investing in public schools and public hospitals, that these deadbeat rich people are just getting a free ride on the taxpayers, on the consumers, and so they're not doing anything. As if, running a business, producing products, employing people doesn't grow the economy. I mean, where does Hillary Clinton think all the tax revenue is coming from to pay for the schools, to pay for the bridges, to pay for the roads? They have no one to tax if those rich people weren't creating jobs and creating wealth out of nothing. Because there's, left to our own, if man was just all by himself, there's nothing. There's no schools here. Somebody had to build these schools. Where does the cement come from? Where does the steel come from? The government didn't create that stuff. The government didn't build that. Free enterprise built that. Capitalists built that. Individual entrepreneurs built that. And even if they paid no taxes, they would have contributed. Because without them, there would be no tax revenue from anybody, because their employees wouldn't have jobs. There'd be no incomes to tax if somebody wasn't generating wealth in the first place. People think, I hear all these economists say, we got to encourage consumption, right? The problem with the economy is there's not enough demand. That's not the problem. There's plenty of demand. The problem is the supply. The problem is we're not producing things. And that's why the economy is in trouble. It's because the productive portion is in trouble, not because there's not enough demand. I mean, how do they think we got so broke? There's that saying, shop till you drop. Well, we did it. That's what we did in America. We shop. But you have in Minnesota, you've got that big mall of America. I mean, we've got huge malls. But where are the factories? You can drive for hours, you don't even see one. But you see mall after mall after mall. Where's all the stuff coming from that is in these malls? China. It's coming from other countries. That's where the economic growth is. You can't have a country that just distributes foreign merchandise, where you borrow the money from the people who produced it to buy the stuff that your economy can't produce. So we've just got this whole phony economy that's being propped up by stimulus and cheap money and big government, and the whole thing is about to implode because they can't keep it going anymore because it's impossible. There are too many holes in the bubble. It's costing the world too much money to keep us afloat. So this real crash is coming. And what are you going to do about it? All you can do is you can prepare for it. I think we're a lot closer to it than we were before. I think the strategies that we have now, I think in '08, when the dollar had this big rally, that was a year where the strategy didn't work. But I don't think that's going to happen again. I don't think that the next crisis is going to see people running to the dollar. I think that's over. I think the next one is where they flee the dollar. We're at the end of the game right now. This QE3 all-in is the end of it. When it blows up, next month, next year, the following year, I can't get it precisely. I would be shocked if we made it through a 4-year presidential cycle without this whole thing imploding. So I think the thing that you need to do is make sure that your finances are in order, that you don't have dollars, that you don't have CDs or muni bonds or treasuries, that you've got your gold, you've got silver, you've got resources, you've got your money abroad, you've got money in foreign equities, foreign currencies or bonds. That is the tax. It's the inflation tax. It is a collapse in the value of the dollar that you have to fear most, not the fact that they might raise the income tax, because that's just taxing the money you earn. Inflation taxes the money that you have, the money that you've saved, that you've already earned. And the taxes are bigger because it's hitting your principal, not just the income derived from that principal. And I think politicians are, they're more willing to raise the inflation tax than income taxes because people don't realize that they're getting taxed. I mean, hopefully the people in this room will realize it, but a lot of Americans have no idea. They just see their cost of living going up and they don't contribute it to the government. And of course, the government never accepts responsibility. They blame it on speculators, they blame it on OPEC, they blame it on everybody but the Fed and but themselves. I read articles all the time now. Why are oil prices so high? Not once do they ever mention the Federal Reserve. Not once do they mention all the money for it, because it's a mere coincidence. They do have nothing to do with one another. So we've got to act in advance to protect ourselves, and time is running out. I don't know, as I said, I don't know if we have months, I don't know if we have weeks or years, but assume it's tomorrow. Always assume the crisis is tomorrow, and just be prepared for it. Don't assume that you've got time. That you can always get to it, because one day you won't have that time. You can't always get to it. And especially now, Ben Bernanke is saying, hey, we're going to keep interest rates at zero forever. I mean, he only will admit to 2015, but he will extend that date as long as he can until it blows up, because he knows the rates can never go up. So if your money is in dollars, you can't earn it. I think it's impossible. The Fed has made that impossible, so you have to do something with your money. And what the Fed wants you to do is buy real estate or buy U.S. stock. I think that's the dumb way to do it. I think there's much better ways to protect yourself from what Ben Bernanke is doing than buying the things that the Fed wants you to buy. Buy the things that will really preserve your value and that will provide meaningful cash flow and appreciating currencies. And recognize that when the U.S. economy implodes, that's a game changer. It's a game changer for the world. It's going to affect businesses. And you need to think beyond that. You need to look at the world not the way it is now, but the way it's going to look in the future when you have a realignment of global purchasing power. When the people who are making all the stuff start consuming it. And as the dollar goes down, it's not going down in the vacuum. Other currencies are going to go up. Other people are going to see an increase in their standard of living. At the same time, we see a decrease in ours. And you need, as an investor, to prepare for that. And try to invest your money and be an owner of businesses that will profit from the emerging middle class in the emerging markets. Countries that are doing all the hard work, where you don't have generations on Social Security and Medicare looking for handouts. You have young people, smart people, hardworking people that are saving their money, that are producing and have all the know-how. They've been making all this stuff for us, right? It's easy to make it for themselves. I have these arguments all the time with economists. A lot of them are conservatives, and they think that they're the ones that have the problem. They say, well, China, they have too much capacity, they don't have enough demand. How is that a problem? They have too much stuff. They have too many factories. They produce too much stuff. We have no factories. They think that we're doing it right because we have all the demand. They've got demand too. They used to make that same argument. I remember one of these guys from the Soviet Union. I think it was, what was it? Vladimir? I forget the guy. I thought it was Putin, but it was some guy. And he was a big, this is back in the 80s, and he was like one of these Russian, he was a spokesman. He was always out there for the Communist Party. And the Russians basically, they had a problem because Russian citizens could see pictures of America, and they had all these stores, and they had all these shelves, right, with all stuff, all the merchandise and stuff. And so how did they explain to their own people? Because they told them that everything is the best in Russia. And America's poor, yet they would see all the stuff on the shelves, and their shelves were empty, right? And basically what this guy said is, he said, well, the reason that the shelves are so full in America is because people are too poor. Nobody can afford anything. So the stuff just stays on the shelf. You see, in Russia, the minute we put something on the shelf, somebody buys it. That's why the shelves are always empty. And he said, look, one day, we in Russia, we're going to have more stuff. But Americans are never going to have the money to afford this stuff, right? It's the stuff that comes first. The money is worthless. I mean, it's easy for countries like China. If they simply let their currency go up, then the Chinese citizens can buy all the stuff they're making. And then they'll have the jobs and the stuff. Right? See, right now, they get the jobs and we get the stuff. And that's a lousy deal for them. See, the people keep saying, this is great for China because they get the job. What's so good about the job? Nobody wants the job. They want the things you can buy. They want the fruits of the labor. They don't want the labor. They don't want to labor. They just assume have the stuff without working. So they work now and they send all the stuff here. The harder transition is going to be for us as Americans. Because what happens when we don't have their stuff anymore? They have factories. We got malls. And it's easy to build a shopping center. Right? It's not easy to build a factory. And more important than the factory is, how do you operate the machines? Anybody can operate a cash register. In fact, you don't even know how to add them. Just push buttons. And you can bring up a cash register. But the skills that you need to actually work and produce stuff, we don't have those. We've got sociology majors. We're not people like So we have a much bigger problem transitioning to an economy than the producers and the creditor nations. So they think, they have to keep the dollar propped up forever because they need somebody to sell the products to. No, they don't. They can buy their own products. They can enjoy those properties. They don't need us. They just like a hole in there. We need them. We just haven't figured it out. But the day of reckoning is coming, and we need to be careful. Anyway, I want to just start taking your questions. They're probably popular for just over an hour. But anyway, we got 2 mics, and you can ask me any questions you want.
Hi. Is JP Morgan regulating the price of silver, and do you expect people to take possession of enough physical silver where that'll, where they'll be falling on the table?
Well, I don't think any one bank is able to manipulate prices over a long period of time. I mean, I know that, some of these banks short silver, and a lot of the reasons that banks are short silver is they don't understand why it's going up, and they think it's going to go down. I mean, they're just making a bet. I did an interview. You can actually see it on YouTube, but I think it was on CNBC, and there was a woman I was kind of debating, and she was like a metals analyst for one of the big banks, and she was telling me how the chart was bearish and that she expected gold to drop a few $100. And I'm looking at the same chart and thinking, this is bullshit. Where's she getting that? I mean, I'm not like, she was introduced as a technician, a technical expert. I said, look, I'm no expert, but I mean, I'm looking at that chart, it's like this. I said, where do you see this big drop coming? And she's giving me all this stuff about why it's stopped really dropping. And so then I said, out of curiosity, we've been in the bull market for about 12 years. Have you bought any gold yet? And at the end of the interview, the host asked her, have you bought any gold? She said, no. So I figured she's never seen a gold chart that she liked, even though it's not what it is for 12 years. This is the Wall Street mentality. They think people who are buying gold are a bunch of idiots. Meanwhile, it keeps going up. And a lot of them go, why are you buying gold? There's no inflation. You see, they just deny that. How could there not be gold? In fact, one of the problems in the gold mining sector is that the price of gold isn't even going up as fast as the cost of mining it. The cost of mining gold has gone up more than the price of gold. So how could there not be any inflation when it costs so much to get gold out of the ground? I think at some point, people are going to realize that there's a lot more inflation than they think, and then the price is going to go straight up. And that'll be, I think, very good for the gold mining companies. They'll finally be able to make a decent profit. But right now, gold prices aren't even really rising. I mean, it's the whole process. And we're not even getting a big increase in supply. So normally, if the price of something went from 300 to 1800, you'd get all this supply because people would want to start producing that commodity. But you can't because it's so much more expensive. There are gold mining companies that are making less money today at $1,800 gold than they made when it was 300. How is that? How is that possible? So I don't think it's a big conspiracy. I just think people are stupid. The same people aren't buying gold. So don't worry about why other people aren't buying it, or just buy it while it's cheap. Because, they're actually doing us a favor, because there weren't so many stupid people willing to sell their gold. Who would we buy it from? And who would we sell it to in the future when it's, 5 or 10 times the price? Right? We need an exit strategy.
My name is Tony Monster from Carver County. Yeah, you've been encouraging us to get out of the dollar. I want to report that after the trip to the convention in Tampa, mission accomplished. But anyways, on a serious note, the Germans who survived the Weimar Republic said that the hyperinflation struck like lightning. In your opinion, do you think that the Fed would be able to pull the plug and increase interest rates before it's too late?
I do think there will be a point in time where they can do something. It won't be without an enormous amount of pain, which is one of the reasons they might not do it. I mean, you wonder, why would politicians keep repeating these mistakes over and over again? It's because they're all the same. They're in the same predicament. They get to a point where, they always want to postpone the pain. Even though they might know they're making the problem worse, they'd rather have it worse in the future. Because they're always worried about, how do I get by this next election? We can't do the right thing because that's too painful. But at some point, you can't buy enough time. So I think we will get to that position. But I do think that we're going to have a lot of inflation. I think we could have 20, 30, 40% inflation and less before. But there will be a moment in time
where they can turn it off. But it's going to be horrifically painful to do it. I mean, it's going to be a collapse, which is, why they won't do it. But destroying the doctor completely, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. I mean, it could happen. But I think that the investment strategy that I have is going to work out either way. I think obviously it'll work out better if there's hyperinflation. But I think there'll be enough inflation before we have hyperinflation that strategy is still going to work. And I still, as an American citizen, hope that we don't end up, completely destroying the dollar. Because just imagine the environment in this country, and especially given the attitude. I mean, it raises the odds that maybe we go all in on socialism and just become a complete totalitarian country. Because think about the civil unrest. Think about what's going to happen when you can't get food, you can't get gasoline. Think of how the whole economy grinds to a halt. And you've got so many people now just depending on government, and they're living on government, and when the government checks don't buy anything. And a lot of people are going to be looking for people to blame. So I hope it doesn't get that bad. But in order to avoid that, it has to get really bad. But the good news is if we actually do the right thing and dismantle the government and shrink it dramatically and get rid of a lot of regulations and a lot of taxes and go back into a free market, it works amazingly well, especially with the technology that we have today. We can rebuild a viable economy much quicker than we could have 100 years ago or 50 years ago. So we have better tools, we have better technology. So it would be great if we can actually let the free market embrace it. And it's not going to be instantaneous, it's not going to be pain-free, but it will be constructed pain, and we'll be able to see the results. And a lot of people will see almost immediately. People who are living off the government, and that's going to be a rude way to do it. But a lot of things will, medical costs will come way down, education costs, certain things will be a lot less expensive for people. And people who are working for a living or actually working will benefit. They're productivity, their work will, they'll have a better reward. A lot of people who are working are going to have to work. A lot of people who pretend to work. There are a lot of people who have jobs who aren't really working. Right? So they're going to have to actually do something for change, so they might not like that.
So you think that they will do more time?
I hope we will. I still think that we probably will, but again, it's going to get really bad before we do it, because most of the people that still don't even know what the right thing is. I mean, there's still Ben Bernanke. I don't think he's just lying. I think he actually thinks it's going to work. So he hasn't figured out yet that it's not going to. And he's going to throw a lot of gasoline on the fire before he figures out that gas is not going to put it out. But they'll figure it out eventually. Now, whether he'll stop pouring it on when he figures it out, that's what we don't know.
Yeah, I wonder what your thoughts on a city that doesn't have any debt, selling bonds to buy building entities.
On what?
Buy building entities.
Buying a building?
Yeah, city needs a building, right? Wants sell bonds to buy a building, president doesn't have any debt.
I'm still not, you want to know if you should buy a building in the city when the city doesn't have debt?
City, yeah. Or sell bonds to buy a building.
City council. The city council should borrow money.
If the city should borrow money. Well, what are they going to do with the money?
Buy the building.
Oh, buy a building. Okay, now I get you. So should the city go into debt? Well, I mean, if there's going to be a lot of inflation, then, depending on how much they have to put down as a down payment, it might be better off just buying gold if they have cash, as opposed to buying a building. But they should certainly sign a long-term lease if they know they're going to, although they might not need all the space, they might be tricky. But yeah, if there's a lot of inflation, obviously it's a transfer of wealth from debtors, from creditors to debtors. But I don't know how the demographics of the city might change if they still own the properties, if they can get, so if you can get long-term financing, you get like a 30-year mortgage at 3-4%,
that seems like a smart thing to do. But, you know, a city, a commercial real estate loan, based on what they have to put down, I don't know what all the terms are to determine whether it would be a good thing to do or not. But if the city has a pension, yeah, it makes sense for it not to be dollars, for them to have assets, just like I would say individuals. They should invest abroad, they should invest in precious metals, particularly if they want to be able to meet these obligations that they might have. And they should try to have their obligations in dollars and their assets someplace else.
Now, when the inflation ends, we're gonna go into deflation, right? So they could be stuck in the building and say that they bought the 4 million, it's worth 2 million.
Well, yeah, but when eventually we have to have the deflation, but the question is, you know, where are prices going to be when it starts and where are they going to end? So the building could be at $1 million and then you can go to 5 million and go back down to 2 million, it's still higher. You don't know where they're going to be. But I do think that real estate in general in America is going to lose value relative to food, relative to energy. We're going to be a poorer country at the end of this. Maybe not in a way in the future, but when the dust settles, we're going to be left as a poorer country. Americans are going to be poor. We're going to have a lower standard of living. We're going to consume a lot less. And I think real estate in America is going to be less valuable for that reason. You know, because real estate is ultimately a function of what you can rent it out for. And if the potential tenants are poor, then you can't charge a lot of rent. And I do think that what that's going to mean is that construction is pretty much going to grind to a halt. Just like I gave you with my example, I think pretty much everybody is going to live in a house that is less valuable than the cost of building it. And so we're not going to build homes. We might not build houses for a generation. But what we're going to have to build are factories, because we don't have those. But the economy is going to change, depending on if you have a building, if it's an office building, we might have a lot of excess supply of office buildings, because we might need different types of structures to do different types of work, because we have too many people in offices pushing papers, and so that's going to have to change. We're going to have more people making things. So, and same thing with shopping center real estate. I think a lot of that real estate is going to really get clogged.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot more to it than just this.
If you don't mind, I have 2 questions. But first, I'd like to thank the Canary Party for hosting us. I have 2 questions. First, is the Iraqi dinar being a scam?
Is the what?
The Iraqi dinar.
Dinar? Are you talking about like a gold-backed dinar?
There's a lot of stuff on the internet encouraging people to go out and buy the Iraqi dinar.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a scam to me. I think there's a scam about like buying old dinars because they're going to revalue them or back up by gold. Yeah, pretty much, if it sounds like a scam, it's probably a scam.
My other question is, I noticed on YouTube you visited your dad. So I was wondering if you could promote the website for your dad.
Freearm, we have the site, freearm.com. Yeah, my dad still, in fact, he just lost his last appeal just a couple days ago. So now we have to try to appeal that. Of course, it's the same judge that made all the mistakes that we had to appeal to. And so he turned it down, and we finally forced it to actually render a decision. He was just saying nothing, but he's just trying to keep him in jail until he dies of old age. And so he delays everything as long as he can. But now we pushed him, and he had to basically say deny the appeal, and so now we have to go try to get up to the Ninth Circuit. But first we have to ask him if we can appeal it, so he'll probably say no, then we got to appeal that. But the whole thing is taking years. We've been doing this appeals for 4 years. Meanwhile, there's no way he's guilty. Even the lawyers, because the lawyers that I have, they don't realize how corrupt the system is. But they've defended people before, and they've gotten people off, and they've gotten convictions reversed, where the error is much less than my father. The error with my father's case is enormous, and if he was an axe murderer, he would have been out a long time ago. But they still have a hard time understanding. How can we keep losing? I said, this is corrupt. They would come out paying all the money. So then they're happy to get to work. And you think they would start to realize, why is it that we have all these winning issues and they just keep getting, and the judge's explanations are nonsense. Pure nonsense what they say. They misstate the law, they misstate the facts. But it's all, they want to keep my father in jail, it's propaganda. They want to send a message that don't fight the government. Don't object to what the government is doing, because we put you in jail. He's like a dissident. He's like, he's like a Soviet-style dissident. He's not in jail because he's a threat to American citizens. He's in jail because he's a threat to the government that is trying to, illegally collect and administer an income tax. And they don't want to have to collect the income taxes, legally, because it would make it too difficult. It's very easy. Having an income tax and having the Constitution are really inconsistent. You really can't have both. Because in order to have the income tax, the way we currently have it, you have to throw out the Constitution. But if you want to preserve the Constitution, then the government has to follow some other way to collect taxes. Because what they're doing now is not right. But the government doesn't want to admit that, so they don't want my father out. They want him in jail. And
Your dad's website?
well, his website, he has a website, paytheincometaxes.com. That's his website. And we have this one free Irwin, but yeah, but there's a lot of stuff. He's got his last book, The Federal Mafia. The only other book in American history to ever be banned by the government was Lolita. Just such Lolita, the only book that's been banned. I wonder if it'll ever be a Trivial Pursuit question. But they banned the Federal Mafia. They didn't see why they banned it, because they couldn't really refute it. So they had to ban it. Yeah.
How do I want to say this? I want to start with you and your father. I shared a lot of tears over sending letters back and forth to Irwin. I read your chapter really quick on taxation, and I kind of disagree with it being a direct tax, and then you use consumption tax, an Hamiltonian method to justify it on the rights of Americans. That's one of our most founding basic rights, is our property and our life, and to tax that is wrong. So to use it to say that the income tax is a direct tax, it's actually an excise on privileges. Most Americans just don't know what that privilege is, as far as foreign income is concerned.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that book, I point out that, well, the way that the government gets around the estate tax and the gift tax, because the government, the government claims that they're excise taxes because they're taxing privileges. So, like, when you give a gift, they don't tax the gift, they tax the privilege of making a gift, and they measure the tax based on the value of the gift. But that's all a lie. I mean, if you own property, it's not a right to give away. I mean, it's not a privilege to give away, it's a right. But when it comes to income tax, what I mentioned is, and I learned a lot of this from my dad, but when the income tax was declared unconstitutional, and because it was imposed as a direct tax, they amended the Constitution, and then when they challenged it again, the courts ruled that the 16th Amendment didn't actually change the Constitution. It simply took the income tax out of the category of a direct tax where it inherently belonged and placed it in the category of an excise. And therefore, the government has the power not to collect taxes on income directly if it doesn't want to be bound by the rule of apportionment, but it can tax it indirectly. And therefore, what the court ruled was not that they were taxing a privilege, but the Supreme Court in 3 different cases said that the income that can be taxed pursuant to the 16th Amendment was corporate profit. So what the Supreme Court ended up saying is that we have a profits tax, and the income tax only applies to corporate profits. I mean, Congress can still tax income if they want to do it apportion it, but if they want to tax income without apportionment according to the 16th Amendment, then the only thing they can tax is corporate profit. The Supreme Court said that 3 times, and none of the cases have ever been reversed. So that's the problem. We have a profits tax disguised as an income tax, and that's, there's a lot in there. Can I just say on the chapter?
I said there's 4 other classes too that have a tax imposed on on CFR 26, and that's foreign people here in the U.S. making income.
I don't necessarily. I don't think so. I think that it doesn't apply to them. But anyway, the courts don't care. The courts just protect that anything that comes in is income, which of course is not. And they make us pay taxes. But a lot of corporations
corporations, there are plenty of corporations that have lots of income, but they pay no taxes. It's because they have no profits. So corporations pay a tax on their profits, but Americans pay a tax on their receipts. You pay a tax on, if you collect some income, you pay a tax on it, even though you might not have a profit by the time you subtract all the costs of it. Because when you get a job, you have to get to work, you need a place to live, because you can't work in your own place to sleep at night, you need a place to get dressed, you need to eat food. The government doesn't let you deduct all these things, but you're supposed to be able to deduct. Yeah.
Over the years, fiat currencies have been created and evolved, and they've been, through the development process of those small situations. But for the U.S., it's such a large economy, so if we accept the assertion that we're going to have a crash in the U.S. dollar, could you explain what the transition period is going to be, what's going to occur, and how long it's going to be, and what does it look like when you decide?
Well, I think the dollar is going to lose a substantial amount of value before we ultimately get to that point where we have hyperinflation or just. And I think the dollar loses its role as a reserve currency. And that will be basically, maybe at the beginning of the end, because if we can't print a reserve currency, then we can't import anymore without exporting. But I do believe that we're going to have to do something. I think that the only thing that would work would be to go back on the gold standard, which would be part of the solution to the problem. Because once the confidence is gone, in fact, my father was at a meeting at the Fed, which was hosted by Ron Paul, this was years ago, and he actually asked a question. They were all there at the Federal Reserve, and they were sitting in this huge room, a huge table. And my father asked one of the representatives, one of the governors there, what is it that gives the dollar value? And his answer was confidence. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. It has value because people have confidence. Well, what happens when they lose confidence? Well, that doesn't have value. And confidence, you have to earn confidence, and you can lose it. And I think when people lose confidence in the dollar, how do we restore it? When people lose confidence in other fiat currencies, what they've generally done is peg it to the dollar. So if you're losing confidence in the peso, okay, well, now we're going to peg it to the dollar. All right, well, what are we going to peg the dollar to? We can't, we're not going to peg it to other fiat currency. So I think it makes sense that we go back on the gold standard. We've only been in office since 1971. In the scheme of things, it's only 40 years. The country's been around for 250, and only 40 of them with fiat money. And so I think we're going to go back to that gold standard. And the question is when are we going to do it? And a lot of people think, well, we never do it. Well, Congress is not going to want to do it. It's going to be in the box, and it's going to have to. Because otherwise, how are they going to restore confidence in the currency? Because once it goes, what's going to stop it from falling? Just because they raise interest rates, does that mean it's still a piece of paper? It still needs to have to be backed up by something.
Thanks for being here today. First of all, how do I get a copy of that book, the Federal Mafia?
Well, you can find it. It's not illegal to sell it. It was illegal for my father to sell it.
Okay.
But it's not illegal for other people to sell it. So if people have a copy, you can find it. I don't have the copies anymore. I have one or two, but I'll keep those. But you can go on Amazon and find them. There are people that sell them.
Okay.
I do have some of my dad's books. I've got cases of the King of Malls and how Economy Grows. I've got a bunch of those. I have some of the great income tax hoaxes. I have a couple of cards of those.
Interesting. As well, I wonder if you could speak to what are some of the parallels between what we're seeing now and what Japan saw in the 90s and into the century, and how perhaps they got out of it, and if that stagflation type of...
Yeah, it's similar in that governments made a lot of mistakes. Why did they have a real estate bubble and a stock market bubble in Japan? It was because the Japanese government kept interest rates too low in order to prevent the yen from rising against the dollar. The yen had risen against the dollar throughout the 60s and 70s, but at some point in the 80s, they decided it had risen enough.
and exporters were getting worried that the strong yen was going to cut into their profits in the U.S. And so the Japanese government wanted to stop the yen's rise. And they did it by creating money and lowering interest rates, and that ended up as a property bubble and a stock market bubble. And when it burst, instead of letting rates go up and letting the yen appreciate, they tried to prevent that from happening, and we had decades of stagnation. But the difference between America and Japan is beneath the surface, Japan is still a productive nation that is exporting and has huge surpluses, and so their economy is healthier, even though the government has screwed it up. They haven't screwed it up to the extent that our government has screwed up our economy. We're in much worse shape than Japan. And there are people that look at Japan and say, look, they've had interest rates near zero for so long, we can do it here too. We can't, because we're not starting from the same position. They started from a position of strength. We're starting from a position of extreme weakness. They don't rely, they don't need to borrow money from anyone. The Japanese government can borrow from Japanese citizens. We can't do that, and Japan still has a surplus. In fact, we owe Japan over $1 trillion. The Japanese government owns over $1 trillion of treasuries. They can cash those in theoretically. Our government doesn't own anything. Our government doesn't own bonds of anybody else. We're broke. So all we got is liability. So I don't think we can do mistakes. But the one thing we should learn, the one mistake we should learn is to let the market correct. Don't just try to prop things up artificially. But we haven't learned that lesson. The only lesson we learned from Japan is we don't think they intervened enough. Right? It's the Carlin School. They should have printed even more money. And everybody thinks that, what's the big problem in Japan? Deflation. I mean, they don't even have that. They have the real estate prices coming down, but consumer prices are going up. But if consumer prices were going down, that would be a bad thing. I mean, I write about that a lot. But the government has been very successful at convincing Americans that the worst thing that can happen to them is that the cost of living goes down. That the things that you want get less expensive, and that's a disaster that the government has to save us from. They have to spare us from being able to buy more stuff for less money. And they try to get us to think that, if prices went down, the whole economy would implode. I guess nobody will buy stuff if prices go down. Well, I guess nobody in the government has ever run a store. Because, if you want to sell more stuff, you have a sale. Right? A sale is where you take the price and lower it. And then more people want to buy. I mean, they've never had a sale where they say, hey, everything is 10% extra today. But this is what the government thinks drives the economy. It's the exact opposite. It's low prices that create demand, not rising prices. The reason that people don't buy stuff is because they can't afford it. If the price comes down, maybe they can afford it and then they buy it. So this is just a massive victory in propaganda. Why does the government want us fearing deflation? So they can create inflation and make us think it's for our good.
Peter, we know that when America sneezes, of course, the whole world gets the flu. How are we going to see the impact of the recession?
Well, remember this whole thing is predicated on the world trying to prop us up. You see, the global economy is screwed up now because it's based on foreign countries selling products to Americans and Americans can't afford them. And so they have to loan us the money to buy their stuff. It's like a giant vendor financing scheme. And so the problem for the world is not that America might collapse, but that they might keep propping us up to avoid that. So that's where you get this analogy, because all of a sudden if you're dependent, if you're sending all your stuff to America, and now we can't buy anymore, that model doesn't work. But the best thing that can happen is that they let that model fail. Because then their economy is going to restructure a bit, and then instead of making stuff for us, they'll make stuff for themselves. That's what has to happen. So, but in the short run, sure, yes, whenever we stop buying, the suppliers, now we're in trouble. And the knee-jerk reaction among politicians is to try to find a way to prop us up. Try to lend us even more money, even though we can't pay back what we've already borrowed, so we can buy even more stuff that we can't afford, instead of allowing the restructuring. Because the restructuring still has some pain abroad.
the lenders and the suppliers, those economies are going to have some pain, but it's not nearly as bad as the pain we're going to have. And in fact, there will be some immediate benefits. In fact, there will be far more benefits than pain. The problem is there are big political factions that are benefiting from propping up the dollar that fund these elections and they give a lot of money to the politicians. So the people who are benefiting from this huge subsidy to America, even though they're outnumbered by the citizens who suffer, they're more of a cohesive political force. Just like in America, we have all these farm subsidies to subsidize the farmers, even though far more Americans eat and have to pay higher food prices. The farmers are a very organized voting bloc, and therefore economic policies that are bad for the nation still are pursued because of the political faction that benefits. The farmers know how much they benefit from the subsidies. The average consumer doesn't realize how much more expensive food is, so they're not organized in opposition. And so the same thing kind of happens with exporters who benefit from subsidizing the U.S. A lot of individual consumers in Japan or China don't realize how much these subsidies cost them. And the politicians, therefore, don't do it to the interest of the public, they do it to the interest of that specialty.
You said the law growing up, does that mean when the Chinese devalued the Chinese yen, was that part of the reselling of the law also when Chinese devalued the currency?
Well, they are that. Everybody's devaluing their currency right now. In fact, it's a race to the bottom, right? Everything's a currency war, right? And the currency war is a different kind of war. See, normally when you have a war, the object is to kill your opponent, kill your enemy. See, in a currency war, the object is to kill yourself. Unfortunately, we're going to win that war.
I'm sorry, I was halfway with a question. What I wanted to ask you was about the impact of euro. How you see euro, of course, you've seen that as collapsing.
I think the dollar is going to fall against the euro, but I think the euro will fall against other currencies. The euro will fall against gold. But the euro will rise against the dollar, and because we're sicker. People thought that, between a beauty contest, we were less ugly than Europe, but we're not. I mean, we're as ugly as Europe is, we're uglier.
I certainly agree with your prediction that we're headed for a serious dollar crash. That said, can you comment on what the least unlikely scenario would be where the dollar didn't crash, or what would have to happen to prevent?
Well, the only thing that would avoid it, the only thing that would stop the dollar from crashing would be, politicians, do the right thing right now. I said, what is the right thing? That is letting interest rates go way up, and then just letting the chips fall. The Federal Reserve puts interest rates up. And let's say interest rates go up to 8%, or I don't know where they go. I have no idea where they need to go. In fact, the Fed should just stop buying. The Fed should just not even target interest rates. The Fed should just stop expanding money supply, stop buying mortgages, stop buying treasuries, and just see what happens to rates. Maybe they go to 10%, maybe they go to 50%. I don't know where the market's going to take them. But I do know that when that happens, the government can't find it. So the government's going to have to call up its creditors and say, we can't pay. It's going to be just like Greece. The U.S. government's going to have to give a haircut. And the banks are going to fail, and people are going to lose money. And, all these terrible things are going to happen. And it's inevitable. It's not like when people say, well, why do I want all these bad things to happen? I don't want them to happen. I feel terrible that it has to happen. But the fact that they have to happen, that's a reality. The fact that maybe we can postpone it by making it worse. We got the mentality now, it's like, we don't have a problem. Like if we jump off the Empire State Building, right? You say we're running off the 50th floor, well, I don't have a problem yet. Well, the minute you jumped off, that's when you got a problem. The fact that you haven't hit the pavement yet doesn't change that. We have a huge problem. Right? If we had, people say, Peter Schiff, you want all those terrible things, you want the government to do nothing. Well, had the government done nothing from the beginning, there would be no problem. But it's because they kept doing something for so long that the problem keeps getting worse and worse. And of course, the worse the problem is,
the more pressure there is for the government to do something. Because after all, it's so bad. We can't swallow this medicine now. It really tastes horrible. Yeah, but it wouldn't have tasted quite as bad as we had swallowed it a few years ago. And if we don't swallow it now, imagine how bad it's going to taste in a couple of years. And now it's like, no, we really can't swallow that medicine. So, eventually you die because you didn't take a bad tasting medicine. So, that's where we're headed. I don't know, what was your original question?
It was just, of the unlikely scenarios where the dollar doesn't end up crashing, what are the least unlikely of?
Well, the least unlikely is that we do the right thing. There's no way that politicians are going to act to avert the crisis. Because why? They're going to hope for a miracle. They're going to do just what Bernie Madoff did. They're going to keep on doing it and hope for a miracle. Now, I don't know. If there are any, what miracle can there be? I joke. I said maybe what they're hoping, right, is that we'll be invaded by some beings from another planet will show up. And when they take me to your leader, they'll come to Washington and we can convince them to buy our bonds. I don't know how we get out of this mess. I don't know what the miracle is that they're all waiting for. But they're not going to admit it. Because the minute they admit the problem, they're done. They're not going to get reelected. So, I think that we actually do the right thing is such a remote possibility that I'm not even going to bother to plan for it. Right? I'm just going to assume that they keep doing the wrong thing, which is what they're doing. Which is print money, right, and credit. That's what they do. And keep trying to print money. And the debt's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you look at the chart right now, we're going, and now we're like this. We're in this section right here, and the graph just keeps on going up to the top of this roof. That's it. We're in. This is the end game. This is the end of it. How much longer it is? But I think if you even look what's going on around the world, look at the sovereign debt crises, look what's happening in Europe. This is the time period where governments are now being held accountable for the fact that they borrowed too much money. Well, how can it possibly be that all the other countries are going to have to face the music except us? And we're the biggest offender of them all. Yet we're going to somehow skirt this whole thing. We're going to get close through without a problem. Not a chance.
Peter, Beachman, thanks for coming up. I just wanted to ask if you could sort of go through what smaller sort of regional bank might go through, when you see the crisis playing out.
The regional banks, I don't know. There's a lot of big banks that are going to fail. The regional banks might depend on, what their balance sheets look like. I don't know what all the various bank balance sheets look like. But I do believe if the government got out of the way and allowed a huge contraction in the banking sector, that all the banks that are too big to fail would fail. And that would be a good thing, because some of the smaller banks would pick up the pieces, and we'd have a smaller banking sector, but they would be better. You see, what we have now is, the exact opposite of what we want. In fact, the moral hazard. The one thing about all the banks that the government felt is too big to fail, the one thing they all have in common is now they're a lot bigger. Right? And this is the worst thing that you would want. You look at an example, my perfect example. I have bank accounts. I have my money at Bank of America, even though I personally believe they're insolvent. And if it wasn't for the government, that's the last place I have money in Bank of America. Now, because the government said Bank of America is too big to fail, and I believe them, right? I put my money there. But if I didn't put it there, where would I put it? I would put it in a different bank that I personally judge to be more creditworthy, more solid. But now that bank doesn't have my deposit. It's at Bank of America instead. And everybody else is making the same decision. They all want to go with the government's guarantee. And so it's a perverse incentive because the big banks get bigger and smaller banks that might be a lot more creditworthy end up going out of business. In fact, they end up getting bought by the Bank of America because they can't compete now, because Bank of America has an unfair advantage at attracting deposits because it's got the implicit or explicit government guarantee.
So it's the exact opposite of real capitalism, where you have survival of the most unfit. Right? The bigger you are, the more insolvent you are, the more people want to give you money. Okay? And so how can you have capitalism with those incentives? You can't. And in fact, the government comes in. Capitalism is a beautiful system. It works great until the government comes in and screws it up. And then when the government screws up capitalism, they say, you see, we told you capitalism didn't work. Because we don't have it. It only doesn't work because we don't have it. If we had it, it would work.
Yeah, has Art Locker paid you your penny yet?
No. But more important than not paying me my penny, he hasn't written me the note. That was a big part of his bet. He wanted a note where the person who was wrong would admit they were wrong to the other person. But not only that, not only has Art Locker not paid me the penny and not giving me a note, he doesn't even acknowledge that he lost the bet. He still thinks he won. That's how crazy he is. And if you haven't seen it, just go on YouTube and watch Petership Art Laffer. It's about a 9.5-minute video from Cubbo. And although Cubbo's not there, but it's Maria, I think, was hosting. And just watch this whole debate. And we had it like in 2006 and see who you think won.
Peter, Mr. Brown, I want to take it back to real estate for a second. I have all my savings and assets invested according to your strategy, much of that at your company. I currently rent a house. And earlier you described inflation as a wealth transfer from creditors to debtors. And I want to get you some of that. So the question is, does a big mortgage, a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, assuming you don't have to put much down, make sense as a
if you don't have to put a lot down, if you can get a house with a 3% down payment or something like that, get a 30-year fixed rate below 4%, you know you're going to stay there, and you don't want to be moving around, you're going to live there for a long time. Yeah, it can make a lot of sense to do that. But for a lot of people, if you don't know where you're going to live, you want some mobility, in the meantime, you buy a house, until there's a lot of inflation, it ain't going up. It's going to go down. So in the short run, you might get cheaper, and you can save on taxes, you can save on maintenance. I mean, ever since I bought my house, I own my house now for not quite 3 years, I've lost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you want to think about it as an investment, which I didn't, if I thought about it as an investment, I never would have bought it. I just thought about it like buying a boat, right? I knew it was going to be bad, I knew it was going to be expensive, but I did it anyway. Because it was the consumption. It was something that I just did, and I've thrown $100,000 down that rabbit hole. And things are constantly breaking. I was renting my house, something didn't work. I picked up the phone, I called the landlord, and I said, fix it. And I didn't care to stop working. I fix it now, something doesn't work, and crap, how much that cost? So there's a lot of hassle, but eventually, hyperinflation. Yeah, I joke that I just keep refinancing my mortgage, and I have another 30-year mortgage. And my payments are pretty big payments. They're now down to like $9,200, I think, a month on a payment. But I keep thinking, well, 30 years from now, what's going to be bigger when I mail in my last payment? The number on the check in the envelope or the stamp on the outside? That's the reason why it's forever stamped.
Peter, I want to reassert who the tree is ahead of here again. My question is, you could expand on the role of the dollar as a reserve currency in upholding the Ponzi scheme, and then secondly, if there's a threshold that where countries delink from the dollar that could kick things into high gear.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how it's going to unravel, but I do think that at some point the prices, I think the dollar is going to go down steadily until it collapses. So the dollar index, which is you look at dollar index, which is a basket of currencies, that's mainly the euro, but right now it's around 80. Let's say it slowly falls through 70, gets down to 60. It's wrong. And then all of a sudden, one day you walk in and it's not 60, it's 54 overnight. It's full of complete trouble. And then the crisis is on. At some point, people think that we can just have a gradual decline in the dollar for 10 years or 20 years. And we've already had that for the past 30 or 40 years. But at some point, people are going to figure this out, and they're not going to knowingly ride the dollar down, especially when interest rates are practically zero. I mean, if you're a U.S. creditor, or you're sitting in another country, and the dollar is dropping by 5% a year or 10% a year, why would you want to own it? Why would you want that's yielding 2%, if you're losing 8%. No, I mean, so eventually there's no one that's going to buy it. And in fact, eventually, no Americans will want to buy US dollar bonds. They're not, why would they want to do it? They'll see how much prices are going up. They'll see, so eventually, it's not like the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort, it becomes the only buyer. And the only entity in the world who will buy dollar without a debt is the Fed. It's over, right? And they have to end it before then. And again, the only way to do it is going to be to take some excruciating pain. Is just, let interest rates go up, and then let the market work. Bankrupt, you have to liquidate all the bad debt. All the malinvestments have to be unwound. Fortunes are going to be lost. All this paper wealth is going to evaporate. There are people who think they have wealth, but they don't. They have claims to wealth that doesn't exist. You have generations of people who are retired. I feel like Obama talks about all the jobs that he's going to create. He's going to create a lot of jobs for people who don't want them. He's going to create jobs for the retired people. In fact, thanks to Obama's going to create so many jobs that a lot of Americans are going to have 2 or 3 of them. But that's not what they want. Even Romney's like, we need jobs, we need jobs. No, we don't, we need stuff. And because we need stuff, we have to work. Sometimes we want to work, we want the stuff. Right? And we have to work to get it. Those people, if they can have all the stuff without working, they can take it. That's why people want to retire. That's a goal. Why do you work? So one day I can stop working. That's the whole thing. Now, a lot of people found a shortcut. You just stop working right now because you can live off that money.
What do you think is the effect of the economy from a big increase in oil from fracking?
Oil prices? Yeah. Well, oil prices are up because of money supply. But yeah, America is going to be disproportionately impacted. See, when the dollar really collapses, oil prices are going to skyrocket for Americans. They'll come down for other people. In fact, if you imagine if the Chinese allow the currency to go up, now let's say the Chinese RMB goes up 5-fold against the dollar. Well, that means that oil prices go down by 8% for the Chinese. And the price of cars go down too, because the steel gets cheaper. And the production costs. So all of a sudden, you've got 1 billion people in China, who now a lot of them can afford cars. You can't afford it, a lot of them can afford to drive it. So they start using a lot more oil. But what do we need? We've got an economy that's based on cheap oil, because we're able to print money and the world sends us their oil. Now I know we've got more oil than we're producing now, but of course we're going to be exporting more of that. It's not going to necessarily be here for Americans, we're going to export it. But our economy is going to be impacted dramatically because a lot of Americans, they work, they have an hour commute. Well, when that commute costs them more than their paycheck, they're not going to want those jobs. We don't have a big infrastructure now. We destroyed all that. We don't have a good mass transportation system. Those cities don't have them. We don't have the rails that we used to have. So we're not set up for expensive gasoline. Even think about it in today's terms. Today's economy, what if gasoline was $20 a gallon? Could the economy function? No. So, we have a lot to do. We got a bunch of Americans with SUVs. So, how are they going to afford those things? It's going to be particularly painful when things get more expensive. And, food is going to be a lot more expensive in America. People are going to be spending almost everything that they earn on food and energy. And so the governments are having to get a lot smaller because in taxes, insurance, stuff like that, there'll be nothing.
Can I just add to that? Just assuming that the U.S. becomes twice the size of Saudi Arabia in terms of the amount of oil that we have, and the price comes crashing down to say 30 in current dollars. Just to say what I would say, same technology increases to the point where we get a lot more of this hydrofracked.
There's a lot of ifs there. If all of a sudden the world can produce all kinds of oil that we don't know about, then the price of oil won't go up as much. But think about all the people in emerging markets. Think about how many people in China don't have cars. And think about when they want to buy them. And are we going to produce enough oil to offset all of that? I don't think that we can do it. We're going to produce more, no question about it, but the demand is going to grow as well. And you have billions of people
who are gonna wanna drive cars, who are riding bicycles now. You know, we're only a few hundred million in America. So I think the dynamics, the supply and demand dynamics, even though we might increase supply of oil, of course, there are a lot of known reserves that are being depleted. So a lot of it is replacing what we're using, and the reserves are, going through. But I think the supply and demand is clearly going to be in favor of demand. Yes, 300 million Americans are going to use less oil, but a billion Chinese, a billion Indians, they're going to use a lot more oil. And so I think that you're going to see prices go up.
Also, finally, just the.
I
had to come to the financial services team where I might be that service.
What percentage do you think gold makes of current large portfolios of hedge funds? Specifically miners, and what do you see?
Well, there are some hedge funds that hold some gold, like Henry Paulson. I think it's interesting, John Paulson, I think it's interesting that a lot of the people that bet against subprime are the same people that buy gold, so they know something. But beyond a few hedge funds, hardly anybody owns gold. I've spoken to institutions, I've spoken to money managers from banks and pensions and big endowments. I've sat in rooms with people who collectively manage hundreds of billions of dollars, and none of them own any gold. None of them. None of them own any gold stocks. It's so under-owned as an asset class among institutional investors. Sometimes they might admit that they own some gold personally, but they never buy it for clients. And so that's going to change one day. One day they'll all be buying it, but of course by then the price will be much, much higher. But for all the people that talk about how gold's a bubble, it can't be a bubble if nobody owns it. It's a bubble in talk. A lot of people talk about it, but they talk about why it's a bubble and they don't actually own it. You do see commercials for gold, but you don't see them in prime time on ABC. Yeah, you'll see gold commercials on Fox and CNBC because they're cable news shows and it's a lot less expensive to advertise there. You don't see them on Sunny TV Dance. They're not on American Idol. Eventually they'll be on those shows when there is a bubble. And in the meantime, it's interesting, the only gold companies that can afford to advertise on TV are the ones that rip off their customers. Because they charge such massive markups. They charge 70%, 100% markups. Yeah, they can afford to advertise. But my gold company, European Capital, we can't afford ads. We mark up 1%, 2%. How are we going to advertise? There's not enough business. I'm not actually selling that much more gold today than I sold 10 years ago. My business should be booming if this is a gold bubble. It's a little bit better. It's not much better. It's not like the phones are ringing off the hook. My salesmen still have to make outgoing calls to convince people to buy gold. See, if it was a bubble, we wouldn't have time to make outgoing calls. They would just be calling us all day long. So we're not even close.
Hey, Peter, this is Jim. Thanks a lot for coming down here, give us some intellectual stimulation here, which you don't get a lot these days.
All right, let's make it quick. There's a few more questions, right? You gotta wrap it up.
A couple quick questions. Practicality.
Just make it one.
All right. Okay, on a 401k that we have in our employers, I was told, for example, you cannot touch that money if you're still employed as an employer.
Yeah, what happens with a lot of these plans is as long as you're working for that employer, you have to invest it within the framework, whatever they've given you as choices. Sometimes it's limited to a certain mutual fund family, and you have those funds. That while you're working for that company, you can't adopt an alternative strategy beyond what he's giving you. So what you can do is you can quit, you can roll all the money into a self-directed IRA, and then you can invest it however you want. But you've got to quit your job first. Now, whether you ultimately go back to the employer later on and get rehired or work as an independent contractor, you can try to do that. If it's a smaller employer, you might be able to convince them to expand your universe so that you have more investment choices that you like. But some people actually have to decide between their job and taking over their investments. And a lot of that depends on how much money you're talking about. If you have a huge amount of money and you can't invest properly, it might be worthwhile to quit that job so you can preserve that wealth and then try to get a different job and the same job back once you've done it.
I know you can take out loans against it, I don't know if you want to do that or not, but I was wondering if there's any other way to roll it to like an IRA or anything else.
You can't roll it to an IRA while you're still employed at that company.
So you
have to set your relationship with the company. Now, in the meantime, while you're employed there, you can certainly borrow against it. But I don't know, it all depends on the rules that your employer set up for the types of loans that you can make and how it works.
Okay, well, I don't know money in the face.
All right. And I don't know if how did we get one more question? All right.
On the 401k, let's say you can bring it to another place, and I guess I'm curious with what you might suggest or recommend.
Well, yeah, look, all you gotta do there, just make sure if you're here, you're on a mail list, fill out one of those e-cards, or just call directly. Pick up the phone and talk to the brokers. Because we have all the individual recommendations. One of the new things we have now at Europe Pacific is individually managed accounts. We have a new RAP program with our mutual funds. We now have 7 mutual funds. We've got 2 more on the way. So we have a nice family fund. We have individually managed accounts. These are all new products that we've developed over the course of the last couple of years. And we can manage money for you in addition to just providing access to foreign markets and charging communities.
Do you have any concern about the fact that it's in dollars, whether it's buying gold or Virgin
No,
markets?
it doesn't matter. People confuse a dollar price with a dollar denomination. If you own a gold ETF in your account and it shows that the price is, $1,600, that doesn't mean you own dollars just because the price is dollars. You own gold. We have to put it in dollars. So every asset that we buy for our clients is all foreign. It's not dollars. Just because the statement says dollars, that's just assigning a dollar value to what you own. But if you own assets that trade abroad, if you own foreign stocks, you own foreign bonds, you own precious metals, you're not in dollars. Even if the statement says you have $100,000, that's just a dollar value of all the foreign things that you own. Because you have to put a value on it every month to put a value on your brokerage account. But don't confuse that and say, well, I'm still in the dollar because my brokerage account says dollars. Just, it's not in dollars. That's just a snapshot of what it would be worth if you sold it that day and you accepted dollars as proceeds. Anyway, thanks everybody for coming.
We are available to answer questions if you have them. And lastly, before everybody gets up, I apologize. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Jen Larson, who is another example of the government intervention in every aspect of your life. So please read that, support the community party. Thank you very much, everyone.
Very good.
Hey, good.
Come on. Let me stop this. This live thing. You know, we were talking to me while this is live streaming.